Howdy, all you delicious people. Well, one thing for sure, I'm not wearing the right shirt. Because when looking at it, I decided to change my shirt, and then I realized, yeah, my shirt doesn't quite match the thumbnail. Uh, that's what happens when this is the first video that you do for the day, and then you realize, yeah, I already done pre-did thumbnails, which ultimately have a different shirt on them. Well, not gonna change them. I'm not gonna change the thumbnails. So, going in it, season 3 of Ash vs. Evil Dead. Really, I would say that season 2, I think there was a lot more interesting parts. There were some interesting things going on into there. There were some funny episodes. There were some goofy things going on. Really, within this third season, I could really sense the fact, and Bruce Campbell kind of confirmed this. It kind of felt like this season they were like trying to go a million miles a minute kind of thing. They were trying, like, I think they were kind of really overextending themselves, trying to get all the things that they needed done in this season, and we end up having it to where, like, Bruce Campbell had mentioned himself that ultimately he had just been burnt out doing this season, because we have it to where Sam Raimi ultimately had directed an early episode and took way too much time to direct that episode, and then like they really needed to kind of like bash out a lot of these other episodes so that way they can get them out. So going into this, I thought that reasonably within this season, I think they kind of do the very predictable route, to be brutally honest, of this season. There's a lot of like predictable ways of which that they write this season, and especially write the very last episode. I'm just kind of like, man, a lot about this just kind of feels so, like, I wouldn't say forced, but like it feels very much like it has, like, bizarrely it has to like fit some formula, which is weird to mention that this show has to fit some kind of formula when looking at all the stuff that was going on in the morgue, seemingly last season. I think reasonably they were doing some fun and goofy stuff going on with, let's just say, a baby this season. But other than that, like, there was a lot of stuff where I was just kind of like, okay, this feels kind of like the same old song and dance that I've seen through any normal progression of show. I ultimately did like the introduction of the new character, the important to Ash's character addition that ultimately I will go into spoilers and much more talk about. So we really have it within this season that I think really I'm kind of torn of the fact of like, had it been that Bruce was doing a lot more this season, or did it seem like he, like, I don't know, I think most of the story might have been much more on Bruce than anybody else. I think there had been some episodes that have kind of tied into Pablo or Kelly a little bit more, compared to this season, where I feel like we very have few times where we have like an entire episode that is just on so and so characters. Like ultimately, we had it to where Ruby had quite a bit of story, and I think Amanda. Yeah, Amanda. I'm gonna probably sneeze here in a second. So, yeah, told you. Ugh. So ultimately there were some reintroducing characters that I felt just kind of like, okay, so probably whoever was doing this show ultimately really just liked getting this actor, And so recently they had to like really use this actor because ultimately they just really love this actor. I'm gonna have to say that in a very cryptic like sense, because this person was in season two, and they brought him back for season three, and I was like, okay, so man, they must really like this actor to try to find some convenient way to have him back in the story this season. And in spoiler terms, you'll know what I mean. So it's a prominent role, I guess. So I really liked the fact that we like. I felt like there was some stuff that I think that they did kind of barely kind of make things better. Like there were some visual things that I thought were better this season compared to quite possibly the first two. But then I could also say it's like, well, yeah, but they also did a really good bit of things in the second season as well compared to the first. Reasonably, a lot of times I think like the Deadites, especially in the first season, were like a lot of just common like, hey, let's slap some makeup on these cats and kind of make them look almost zombie esque. Where I think eventually we get into much more of an escalation with money and escalation with seemingly effects, and so ultimately we have it to where like you can see a progression going on eventually, but when looking at it, like I don't know, it could honestly just be kind of like the same old same, where it's could be more, could be less. I don't know. But I think they're like to me, like season two probably had a lot more effects in it than this season, but to each their own. So going into this season, I immediately, I feel like season three starts out kind of like season two did. Uh, like with the exception of it seemingly being that we have it to where Ash is ultimately just like having the time of his life until basically the gates of hell end up opening up yet again, and then to ultimately it's like, okay, now guys, settle up. It's time once again to like it's kind of that kind of approach where it's like you have it to where Ash is ultimately just having fun, uh, but then ultimately we have it to where that Ghostbuster moment where we have it to where, okay guys, it's time to zap them and trap them kind of thing. And so reasonably, I thought it was an odd approach to in this season to get to the evil part in the very beginning of this season. I think now it's just going to get to the point to where they just have to like figure out a way to just open every season up with there just being like Ash is basically just letting a lot of things just kind of slip through his fingers consistently, I guess. I don't know. I don't quite buy how we have it to where if there is a thing that does exist, why isn't Ash consistently having his mitts on it, his hands on it consistently? Just ultimately just looking over his shoulder, just waiting for something to pop up this season. So, like, yeah, he would be super paranoid at that point, but when looking at it, it just like I don't know how many times that ultimately we're gonna have Ash being thrusted into the arms of a deadite at some point. So that's all I wanted to say so far in the very cryptic like sense, in the very non spoiler like sense. I still had fun with this season. I just felt that reasonably. I thought I had a lot more fun in season two than season three. I think when really watching season two back, like season two was so goofy. It was so goofy. It was fun goofy. It was really fun to watch. I think this season was just kind of like, yeah, I'm kind of expecting this, and I'm kind of okay. I'm kind of like I'm starting to really just feel like the same old story that kind of has been told through other kind of progressions of things. And so ultimately, let's get into those progressions. Let's ultimately get into spoiler time. Let's ultimately bust out the double five to otherwise take our time to enjoy and talk about the season for what it is. About that spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, spoilers now. So, reasonably, the very beginning of this, we have it to where we have Ash ultimately uh, opening up, seemingly, well, probably opening up Brock Williams's uh, hardware store. Ashy Slashies is, I guess, the place of which he's calling it now. Which I'm like, yeah, I'm like, that's good to actually keep that name around because I actually like that name, Ashy Slashy, from season two. Like, I like the fact that they're kind of continuing that name because I actually liked Ashy Slashy. That was kind of a really good name used in the first in the I mean in the last season, and they're keep going with it. So we end up having it to where Ash ends up doing a commercial that seems like the very much hilarious approach to a commercial, but looking at it, he's like, yeah, like we're gonna slice our prices as he has his chainsaw like cutting like what is to be CGI like sales and stuff like that going on. We end up having it to where ultimately Ash is going on and going into uh, having a hardware store because ultimately there is no evil afoot, or it seems that there is no evil afoot, but there's always evil afoot. So we end up having it to where Kelly ends up kind of flipping through the channels, and it seems that we find out that the Necronomicon is being auctioned somewhere as an antique. We end up having some guy thumbing through the pages of the Necronomicon, reading it, of course, because that's what everyone does. And we end up having it to where Kelly ends up calling, hey, yeah, like the evil has risen again, kind of thing. And so ultimately, we got to figure this whole thing out. So we end up finding out that ultimately we end up having Ash ends up going and finding out that he has had a lost love. Ultimately, a girl, I believe her name is uh, Candice Barr, which ultimately we have it to where Ash calls her Candy Bar, which I thought was interesting. Like it was a kind of fun name, and I thought that was like really interesting. So we end up having it to where Ash is having a reflection moment of remembering their seemingly their night of one night of uh, overnight bliss. We have it to where seemingly these seemingly Ash and seemingly Candace ultimately had gotten severely drunk, had gotten married, had basically effed in their car, and we ultimately have it to where we are to find out that seemingly Ash had spurned a child. Spurned. So we end up finding out that uh, we ultimately have Ash having a child, and her name is Brandy Bar, which I'm ultimately thinking like, oh my god! I'm like, I heard that ultimately they were gonna have a kid this season, like they were gonna have Ash like give him a daughter this season because ultimately I'd heard via spoilers when I was listening to the Bruce Campbell Inside of You interview, where we have Bruce talking about this last season, how it's like, oh yeah, it's a natural progression. We gave him a kid and we gave him a wife, kind of thing, and so I was immediately thinking, I'm like, well, are they going to kill the kid off? Are they going to like, are they basically going to give him all these things just to take it all away towards the end of the season? are they eventually going to kill Kelly and Pablo this season? Because when looking at it, there needs to be a big hurrah or huzzah going on in this season. So what ends up happening is we tear Ruby into the mix because we always have to. It seems that Ruby is to eventually get her hands on the Necronomicon again, and we seemingly have it to where Ruby is talking to some, like I would call it, you know, in those Disney movies where you have it to where the woman talks to the mirror and the mirror talks back to her, ultimately telling her that like ultimately you have it to where the woman is saying like mirror mirror on the wall, who's the beautifulest one of all, and whatever, and we have the mirror saying like, oh, you are. Like, it's kind of that thing where we ultimately have it to where Ruby is bizarrely like putting blood all over this page of this Necronomicon, and we bizarrely have it to where there is now a woman speaking to Ruby through the Necronomicon. So we end up also having it to where seemingly Pablo is starting to get his tats back from the Necronomicon, which ultimately I'm like, oh, great. So he's going to end up, just losing his effing mind again? We ultimately have it to where Kelly ultimately has a seemingly Knight of Serbia or whatever, ultimately on her side in this season, which I'm ultimately just like, okay, that's interesting. So, pushing on. So, we end up having it to where, okay, Ash and Pablo are seemingly working at this hardware store together. Well, I think also Pablo is kind of doing a food truck or something like that. So, we end up having it to where Ash ends up forcibly going and having to find his daughter, which his daughter is at this school. And I'm like, oh, okay, so we have to do the approach of everything has to do with a school now. So this is kind of tailoring to any supernatural show that you would have. So it's like, instead of actually having a younger Ash that ultimately is in high school, no, we're just gonna send Ash to the school to do school stuff and have him also reminisce about the school that he was in. So, okay, so we end up having it to where Ash ends up going into the school, and I think the coolest event of the coolest thing of this season is honestly what goes on in this school in the early episode. You ultimately have it to where seemingly the mascot of this school ends up coming into being a monster, which I think was the most interesting effect of this entire season, beyond anything else. We end up having it to the mascot ends up having this grotesque grin and eyes, and I thought that was an amazing effect. So we end up having it to where seemingly Brandy and her best friend, who I think is Heather. I could be wrong about that. It could possibly be Heather, or it could be Rachel. I think that it's probably Heather. We ultimately have it to where I'm assuming Heather and Brandy end up making it into the band room, and so we eventually have it to where Candace and Ash makes their way to the school. We end up having it to where Ash ends up having to completely fillet and just really just tear up this mascot, because ultimately we have it to where the mascot's coming down and Ash is like, no, not you too, Cougar, or whatever the mascot name is. Not you too, they got you. And so ultimately we have it to where so Ash is just, of course, as per usual, just tearing this mascot apart. But at some points we also have it to where this mascot is also outpowering Ash to kind of chucking him around and stuff like that. So there was some interesting things going on with this mascotted part, and then ultimately we push on into Ash ultimately now having to go up against Heather, which ultimately we have Heather who ends up turning. And here's also some really interesting parts. So we end up having it to where Heather ends up poltergeisting every single one of the instruments. So you just kind of see like instruments just flying over all over the place. We end up having it to where Ash ends up. Pablo ended up getting a lick into this mascot as well. He ended up putting an axe in the mascot's back, but Pablo ended up getting thrust away, sadly. So we ultimately have a tour of Pablo with his trusty axe this season, which is really interesting to me. We ultimately have it to where seemingly so Ash goes through this musical room, and he is starting to play around with instruments one way or another. We end up having it to where like drumsticks get put into his like nose and in his ear, and we ultimately have it to where he takes a a shotgun into a trombone or trombone instrument and pulls the trigger with a shotgun and decimates the trombone. We end up having it to where Heather is ultimately at this piano, but eventually it gets to the point where it seems like Heather is just kind of all over the place. To where ultimately it seems that we get it to where eventually that Heather is by this harp. So we end up having it to where Ash ends up taking this harp and kind of pushing it over to where Heather is now just kind of caught in this harp. And we have it to where Ash ends up going and pushing the harp even further down to kind of skew through like kind of like a cheese grater or an egg grater or whatever through Heather's head. So ultimately, we have it to where I guess this, I'm assuming probably piano wire, is so strong that ultimately just cuts through uh, Heather, which ultimately kind of leaves like several layers, like a loaf of bread of head, uh, which I thought was just a really interesting visual. Probably a lot of people thought it was gross, but I thought it was really interesting. So we end up overall just saying that okay, Heather is questionably like really dead, because when looking at it, it seems like they kind of every time Brandy is like weak or scared or whatever, ultimately kind of like Heather is in kind of like the back of her mind. But so, anyways, we have it to where eventually we also find out that Candice Barr ultimately took a percussion. I think it's like a cymbal or something, like through the neck, and her head is now Demzo. She's now Deadzo. We ultimately have it to where ultimately she is to be kind of humiliating Ash for a little bit, but ultimately, what exactly does that doesn't really accomplish much. But ultimately, we have it to where yeah, Candace is dead. So we end up having it to where Ash is now just taking Brandy under his wing and basically saying that it's like, well, hey, like you're my kid now, like I'm your dad, and like we have it to where Ash is like doing all the dad tropes and stuff like that, where and Ash is basically telling her it's like, well, hey, like you can't tell anybody that you had killed some deadites, kind of thing. You can't tell anybody what you've been doing. Like you can't. go out and just tell people that you've been fighting the dead, because no one will truly believe you. Everyone will think that you're crazy. So we end up having it to where Brandy ends up going and going to the one person that she thinks that could comfort her in this time of need, which is her guidance counselor, I believe. We end up finding out that her guidance counselor is not only Ruby herself. So we end up also finding that seemingly Ruby is using the Necronomicon to spurn a child within her belly. So we have a lot of times where ultimately Ruby is consistently lifting up her shirt to showcase the demon seed which is within inside of her belly. So we ultimately have it to where Ruby ends up getting seemingly having this child go up out of her body, and so we end up having it to where the baby ends up attacking some common man off the street. We end up having it to where the baby with umbilical cord in hand ends up just devouring somebody. And so we end up having it to where Ruby ends up getting kind of willy-nilly people off the street to ultimately go into the grinder or the feeder of this child. And so ultimately we have it to where we have uh, limbs and just anybody that Ruby can find to ultimately in time just nibble away at the otherwise just really dumb and or stupid people. I'm gonna pause here for a second. Okay, I wanted to confirm the progression of where I'm going with here. So we have it to where, okay, so Ruby's had child, ultimately demon spawn, and so on and so forth, as per usual, because Ruby always kind of spurns out a child or two that ultimately is, shall we say, not exactly the normal run of the mill child. And we'll have a bowling ball into the mix here shortly. So, or two bowling balls. So we end up having it to where seemingly we find out that Ash realizes that Ruby is with child, and we ultimately find that Ash goes into rescuing this blonde damsel in distress that really can't speak English, and we end up having it to where this blonde girl almost goes and hits Ash with this sink to otherwise think that since that this baby is really only after Ash and not her, that ultimately she's going to sacrifice him so that way she could run off, she could run away. So what ends up happening is that the baby ends up going and killing the blonde girl, basically uh, taking off her head. We end up finding out that this baby seemingly has like-minded abilities of Ash, where ultimately we have it to where this baby ends up having a saw of sorts for his hand. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have the baby going right into this woman's gooch, and ultimately we have Ash ultimately yelling out like, "Hey, you're not quite ready for that kind of thing yet." So we end up having it to where the baby ends up going into this person's body and having his head be the head of this person. So we have a baby in a adult and now kind of playing around with its body. So we end up having it to where consistently the baby keeps popping out of the neck, and then ultimately he is popping down from this woman's down below, so to say. So we have to where consistently this baby is just popping back and forth from either hole, and we eventually have it to where Ash's master plan is to otherwise take a bowling ball and shove it into both holes to ultimately the baby is to, I guess, get stuck. And so while he ends up getting stuck, we end up having Ash going and tossing this baby stuck in an adult person's body, ending up being wrapped into some rug and or carpet. And we have it to where Ash ends up tossing this baby into a trunk. So we end up having it to where seemingly Pablo and Kelly and Dalton are all going on some road trip, and we end up finding that seemingly when Ash is to come back home, we are eventually to find out that one, that evidently Brandy is sleeping in Ashley's sister's room. So we end up finding out that seemingly that Ash's father had supposedly come back from the dead. We are led to believe. So we end up having it to where Ash ends up going as like, hey, like, who the heck is this? This is not my father. I know my father's dead. So we ultimately have it to where Brock Williams or Lee Majors comes back to ultimately kind of either play the villain a little bit of Ash again, to ultimately it seems like they have a little bit of a fight out, which I'm like, okay, these scenes are kind of really interesting. We end up having like pushing both Bruce and Lee like into this oven where ultimately we have it to where they're supposedly getting like their face burnt and stuff like that from this oven and so on and so forth, which I thought was interesting. So we end up having it to where Lee and Bruce end up fighting it out, which I thought was really interesting because it seems that really this Brock Williams is really just a hocus pocus maneuver to otherwise have it be that Ruby is playing with trying to figure out a way to get Brandy away from Ash, or ultimately just trying to lure her in to a false sense of like, well, hey, like I can help you. I can have people that can find a way to help you. It seems interestingly enough, we have an entire episode that is otherwise tied to uh like speaking about Brock. We'll get to that soon. Uh so we'll get to one part and then we'll get to the part where ultimately we have Ash going and donating a little bit of specimen, let's just say. So we end up having it to where so Ash and Brock are fighting it out, and we eventually have it seemingly that Brock does come back. The legit Brock comes back as a ghost that is ultimately all blue, like Star Wars like. And but then eventually he changes into looking like a normal human being, but he's a ghost. So we end up having it to where Brock ends up going and showcasing a memory to Bruce. Seemingly a memory that Brock has that ultimately showcases uh, a Knight of Siberia or the guy one of the guys that is otherwise tied to Dalton, Knights of Serbia, ultimately had come to Brock and ultimately had warned him about things. And so we ultimately have it to where seemingly Brock had accidentally murdered somebody and then hid the death of this person uh through this basement ultimately to have it to where seemingly Ash finds out, like, oh, you had an underground basement this whole entire time? So ultimately, it seems that this knight had left some evidence of him being there and ultimately scribbling all of this stuff and writing all these pages and everything like that. So that I thought was really interesting. So we'll get into Ash stuff. We're gonna convene to just go into talking about what happens to Dalton, Kelly, and Pablo. So we end up finding out through this road trip that it seems that Pablo is kind of getting a little bit goofy. We end up finding out that Dalton ends up going and getting killed by Pablo. Sadly enough, it seems like we're finding out that Pablo is turning evil, and we end up having it to where seemingly is it Kelly and Brandy? It might not be Kelly and Brandy. It might be I want to say it's Kelly and Brandy, but I could be wrong about this. So I want to say it's Kelly and Brandy. So we end up having it to where, let's just say Kelly and Brandy, because I don't really remember. We end up having it to where seemingly Pablo is really huffing and puffing and blowing his house down. We have it to where Pablo is doing the cliche-ish Wolf and the Three Little Pigs kind of approach to being a villain in this story for a brief time. We end up having it to where I guess there is some magical thing happening that is going on with Pablo. To ultimately we have it to where Kelly is trying to figure out how to solve this riddle of having Pablo being the good guy again. Because ultimately we have it to where seemingly Pablo ends up trying to make his way through the place where Kelly is at, and eventually he ends up biting her seemingly on the leg, and eventually we have it to where Pablo is seemingly coming to Kelly via her leg. It seems that ultimately Pablo's face is ultimately fused onto Kelly's leg as seemingly a transference of sorts, which I thought was really interesting, but also a little goofy. So we end up having it to where seemingly we find out at some point that we are to have this is an awful transition. So Kelly goes and tries to solve the whole Pablo situation, ends up doing so, and ends up turning back to Pablo from evil Wolfman to now normal Pablo via magic. And so we are to ultimately confirm that that is all resolved, even though Pablo or Dalton is still dead. So we end up having it to where everything is about trying to have it be that Ash does not have any more children. It seems, pardon me 1 second here. It seems, interestingly enough, that we have it to where Ash, even himself, gets concerned about that there quite possibly might be more children out there that Brandy at some point will recollect from somewhere and have them all come back to Ash saying, "Oh my God, Dad, these are all your other offspring," that you'll just like as if everybody's going to eventually come come back all at once to ultimately say, "Oh, hi, Dad," kind of thing. So we end up having it to where reasonably Ash goes his way to a donation place to donate his man juice, let's just say. So we end up having it to where Ash goes into a donation place, and we end up having it to where Ash is basically looking at topless women, trying to beef jerk it, so ultimately he could be able to donate his man juice. And so ultimately we have it to where seemingly the doctor ultimately turns into a deadite and tries to go out of his, or goes out of her way, I mean, to go and attack Ash, because ultimately they cannot have Ash deliver anybody any more of donors. So we end up having, bizarrely, this doctor ending up trying to attack Ash with man juice, which I thought was hilarious. We ultimately have it to where this doctor is tossing this man juice consistently at Ash, and he's like ducking and dodging all this juice that is coming his way, let's just say. So we end up having it to where seemingly this nurse just goes ape crap, and she ends up like bashing her way into this like uh glass door, and just kind of grabbing all this stuff. So we end up having, as course as per usual, Ash kind of muscles his way to kill this person, and we eventually have it to where seemingly during these episodes we end up kind of seeing Ash kind of really showing his age, I think, through a lot of these episodes. A lot of times, like, it's difficult for, like, maybe Bruce evidently had some back problems or something like that during these episodes. You could kind of tell, kind of like, seemingly the wear and tear that each one of these, like, episodes were doing on Ash, seemingly much more so than before. We really had it to where, like, Ash was really trying as much as humanly possible to really just kind of uh, flip and drop and all these kinds of crazy maneuvers. And I was like, man, there's a lot going on here that ultimately Ash is having to try to do through a lot of these episodes. So we end up even having at some point that ultimately the magazine is ultimately that Ash had seen with basically the topless woman. We end up having the magazine end up like grabbing, tossing their hand out to grab onto Ash's huevos to try and get him to no longer be able to spurn another child. So we end up having to where Ash eventually goes and puts the magazine into a drawer and smashing the hand. Ultimately, he cuts the hand off, or severs the hand off of the magazine. So I thought that was kind of a really fun maneuver to take down the hand, which ultimately was attacking Ash. I thought that was a really interesting and fun thing to do. I thought that whole scene was really fun. Where ultimately you have it to where the woman ultimately is mentioning like God, what are you looking at? And we have it to where Ash is like, well, what do you think I'm looking at? Like, I thought that whole scene was actually pretty interesting because it was hilarious. So we go on. So Ash ultimately is trying to make a donation, but he couldn't. And ultimately, basically, everyone at the donation hospital ends up getting killed because of Ash's donation. So pushing on. So we seemingly have it to where we have in here. Blah, there's so many transitions that I have to do. Blah, blah, blah. Anyways, we are to find out that seemingly there are more Knights of Serbia, and we have it to where eventually that the Knights of Serbia eventually introduce themselves to Ash and his family, and So ultimately, we are to hear the tale of like, well, yeah, Dalton ended up dying, so that sucks. We end up having it to a reasonably like Kelly ends up coming back, I think with Brandy, and they end up going off into like with the Knights of Serbia. So we end up finding that eventually Ruby ends up going and taking Kelly and changing her into the woman that is from the book. We ultimately seemingly have it to where when we have it to the Knights of Serbia go down into this basement to go and play with powers that they should not be playing with. We end up having it to where some guy otherwise volunteers to go through the portal to see to see what happens. And he comes back to be a Deadite. So we end up having this guy coming back to be a Deadite to ultimately have it to where he ends up killing every single one of the other Serbian knights. And we end up having it to where this Deadite ends up fusing other people together as one big, like, it's basically the Power Rangers maneuver when you have it to where you have the Zord, where it ultimately becomes like a Megazord. You end up having it to where this guy ends up ripping like a head off of some other person and ends up like putting it upon himself, and we end up having like one guy being torn in half to otherwise be like joined with this guy. It's so weird and it's so interesting. So we eventually have it to where Ash ends up fighting this Deadite Megazord, let's just say. And of course, as per usual, we end up having it to where Ash just kind of chainsaws his way through this zombie and stuff along those lines. So we eventually have this one last night of Serbia ultimately saying like, "Oh my God, how could this have happened? How could they have all died?" It's like, well, because you're nothing characters. Immediately when I saw, oh, okay, so these are just kind of characters that are just going to be fed to the machine, which is evil. Basically, told you right then and there. So we end up having it to where Pablo eventually is to find out, because Pablo ends up going down into this this basement as well. We end up having it to where Pablo eventually finds out that Kelly is the real Kelly is actually uh in the other other opposite door thing and whatever. We end up finding out that seemingly Kelly is in another dimension, which is beyond this Stargate-ish like door thing. So we end up having it to where Pablo is just kind of like, okay, like I have to believe that this is the real Kelly, and ultimately now when Ash is going to be thrusted with this Kelly that seems like Kelly, but we're not sure. We end up having it to where Pablo confesses to Ash that like this is not the real Kelly. So we go on. So we end up having it to where Kelly eventually goes with Ruby because reasonably uh, villain and villain together. So we end up having it to where Kelly eventually turns full on evil because of course she does. But we end up having it to where they can't ruin Kelly's body because ultimately Kelly's body has to remain alive as per usual, or otherwise they can't bring Kelly back from where she's at. So we ultimately have it to where Kelly is to go into this seemingly purgatory-esh like place. So we end up finding out that seemingly Kelly's off in this purgatory-ish like place, and she gets reconnected with Dalton, which ultimately is here as well. So we end up finding out that seemingly there is some kind of Reaper-ish like thing that is collecting everybody in this environment. And it seems that Pablo ends up, or Pablo, Dalton ends up rescuing Kelly from that carnage. Ultimately, we have it to where seemingly Dalton is to mention that that if the thing sees you, there's no way that you're going to be able to get away from it, kind of thing. So now here is the big hoopla. So we end up having it to where Brandy is to have a dance of sorts at her school, as per usual, classic way to kind of end a season. So we end up having it to where Ruby is kind of the person kind of throwing this whole dance thing. And so we end up having it seemingly where Ash is going to come in and try to rescue Brandy because he knows full well that something is going to be going horribly awry at this dance. But then also, we have it to where Ruby's kid has grown up to be Ash. Like, basically, spitting image of Ash, which I'm like, good God, how many times do we have to have, like, Ash being cloned in seemingly every season or seemingly every bit of one of these Evil Dead movies? There always has to be some Ash clone going on, and so ultimately we have Ash clone number 812 at this point. So we end up having to our Ash clone, or Ash, baby Ash, let's just say, even though it's much older, it's the same Ash as Ash, but you know what I mean. So we end up, and I'm just gonna keep calling it baby Ash, so we can tell the difference between good Ash and baby Ash. So we end up having to where baby Ash ends up going and seemingly filleting and or killing via chainsaw two people that are kind of making out at this dance, ultimately just kind of doing their own thing. We end up having it to where Ash ends up going like, "Hey, you guys wanna, not smoke any weed? Don't smoke any weed, you guys." like, hey. So we end up having it to where Ash ends up going and just chainsawing through these people to ultimately have evidence that Ash is now evil. We end up having it to where Brandy is supposed to be convinced that Ash is the evil incarnate, and eventually we have it to where Brandy ends up finding a trail of blood that is to lead her to see her father walking in to ultimately help her. So we end up having it to where Brandy ends up running away from Ash at this dance, and we end up having baby Ash that is kind of wreaking some carnage here and there, and then running off in the shadows to wait for real Ash to show up. So we end up having it to where eventually Ash is to chainsaw his way through Ruby, knowing full well that Ruby is immortal, because earlier we had it to where there was a face off between Kelly and Ruby, and of course Kelly lost because every single thing that Kelly was trying, shooting her way through Ruby, slicing and dicing her way through Ruby, nothing was working. Like, there was so many interesting moments that were happening that Ruby was kind of recollecting herself back together, and I thought that was a really fun scene to showcase. But eventually led to Kelly's death, or what would be really a just transformation into another person, hence why Kelly was a different person. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to have to tailor back to, because ultimately I will forget about it, but then I'll remember it later, sadly enough. So we end up having it to where Ruby ends up getting chainsawed through her stomach. Forcibly, Ruby is doing this so Ash looks horrible. We end up having it to where Ruby ends up tossing off to the side, ultimately trying to get Brandy to just be like, yeah, he's evil, he's awful. But the interesting thing is, we have it to where Brandy is like remembering all the good times that she's had with her father, to the point where ultimately, when the cops end up opening the trunk where there's a baby that's bloody in the trunk, uh, because ultimately it seemed that Ash had put the baby with the bowling balls in the trunk, and the cops ended up finding it just to find the baby was there, and ultimately they're just like, yeah, like, what's going on with this baby? Like, this makes no sense. And ultimately we have it to where Ash ends up like having to run off because the cops don't believe that this baby is evil, because he's just going to be the innocent. Ooh, look at me, I'm a baby. I'm in the trunk. Help me. So we end up having it to where Brandy and Ash run off to go to this dance, and that ultimately is what led uh, Ruby to go on to this dance and ultimately get us to eventually getting on to this whole event here. So we end up having it to where Brandy ends up taking the knife that is supposed to go and kill Ash, but we end up having it to where Brandy ends up not being able to take care of business, and so we end up having it to where reasonably baby Ash ends up making his way to just try to attack Brandy. We end up having Ruby getting back up to ultimately just saying like, well, I guess I tried the best I possibly could, but there's no way for me to win over Brandy, so like there's just no moot point. So we eventually have it to where Ash kind of uh, Ash ends up, funny enough, like talking to himself and ultimately calling, "Hey, handsome," and we ultimately have Baby Ash turning around, and so we end up having it to where Ash, of course, takes out Baby Ash, of course, because in the usual way, of course, chainsawing and whatever through him. So we end up having it to where it is now time between Ruby and Ash. So we end up having it to where Ruby ends up going and sending a blade to get to Ash, and Ruby ends up kind of taking the bullet for Ash, which ultimately pushes Ash to go and say like, okay, well, I need to go back into the realm of which that ultimately Kelly is already, and pull Kelly out of there, and also pull Brandy out of there too. And so we end up having it to where Ash is to go and try to collect these souls, but the only problem is he's grabbing all the dead bodies and he's taking them all to his basement, and now we have to have Ash die to be able to make it through this portal. We're ending up having Pablo ending up staying behind so that way he could get everybody from the other dimension into this dimension. So we end up having it to where forcibly Ash has to do himself in. He has to kill himself somehow. And so he ends up deciding, it's like, well, hey, how about I just, like, soar through the heart kind of myself and go into this dimension. So we end up having Ash having a real problem trying to end himself. And we end up having Pablo trying to, like, force the knife into uh, into Ash. Like basically, we have it to where Pablo and Ash have to try and kill Ash together, and we eventually have it to where Ash and Pablo end up stabbing Ash, and he ends up falling over. So we end up having it to where Ash ends absurdly wanting to drive his car into this other dimension. So we end up having it to where reasonably Ash is going and trying to take this car and I guess driving it out of the portal, which is this purgatory. And it seems like the car isn't working. It seems like the car isn't working. Eventually, we have the Reaper character that is going and trying to have seemingly all of his minions uh, collect Ash and this car. So we end up having it to where Dalton ends up sacrificing himself so that way Ash could get much more time. We end up having to where Ash ends up kind of pulling off being able to drive away from this Reaper character, but eventually we have it to where Ash ends up running the Reaper character over. So we have it to where eventually Pablo ends up going and taking Ash as well as Kelly and Brandy all from one dimension to back to this other dimension. So we end up having it to where here's where it kind of gets goofy in this towards the end of this season. We really just have it to where Ash ends up going and having to face off against this big old gigantic monster. And I was just like, okay, this makes no real rational sense of why we're even doing this, but okay, sure, I'll bite. So we end up having it to where bizarrely we have this like Godzilla like moment where we have it to where Ash ends up having to forcibly go into this tank to fight off this giant monsterish being. And of course, as per usual, Ash ends up taking down this gigantic monster with this tank. Ultimately, I honestly do not know why like this is going on to just kind of tail end this show. I think reasonably it was just to the point of just like, well, we just needed something to do, and this had to just be it. Because reasonably, I just thought that that was such a goofy way to end this season. Um, and yeah, he ends up going up against a gigantic uh Conda Kandana, the giant monster. Let's just say. I was trying to figure out. I was trying to go in and think that I could find a descriptive thing of the last episode. Just be like, what the heck was even that thing? Because I really didn't understand it. I think towards the very end of the episode, I'm like, okay, you have to have a cliche-ish giant monster-like approach because ultimately we need to have a big escalation of this season, and ultimately this giant monster had to be it kind of thing. And reasonably, that's all I could really say about this episode. Was eventually we have Ash taking down a giant monster via this tank because we end up having uh, this this giant monsterish character end up taking form. I believe the monster that was actually in the dimension ends up coming into this this dimension and ended up trying to wreaking havoc as a giant monster. I believe that's hence why they had to do the thing that they ended to do with the tank, bizarrely. So really at the end of this, we have to where Ash, his daughter, and everybody is back to normal, uh, seemingly for the most part, with the exclusion of Dalton ending up dying for the group. So reasonably, there was not much of a drastic shift within this season, and so reasonably we have it at some point that the interesting thing about Pablo is he talked to Kelly about their first kiss, and that's what got him to figure out that Kelly wasn't Kelly. And we have it where eventually it seems that Kelly and Pablo had cemented the relationship with another kiss. So I'm just kind of like, okay, so are they in a relationship or aren't they? Is it just like one of those things where they're just kind of kissing every once in a while, but it's not a real legitimate relationship? Who knows? But recently we have to where Ash is seemingly a dad, and I thought that was kind of the most interesting thing of the season. Really, there was a lot of me just trying to really bash and kind of really uh, ash our way through most of this, just to rush through it. Because ultimately, I'm like, whoa, like trying to get through a lot of this whole entire season, and plus, there's only 10 episodes, so it's kind of easy to just kind of like really just bash through a lot of this. But I thought really this season was fun. It was just really, it was just, yeah, there was a lot of story that just kind of felt so much like I liked the first season, or I liked the second season out of the three stories. It seemed like there was a really good story and approach into with the exception of the whole time travel thing that got a little goofy. But I thought like the second season out of the three like the second season was probably the best season. I kind of get annoyed where it seems like every single season we have to go back to the cabin every single season. But that is what it is. There always has to be like a cabin thing approach kind of. I think this one kind of wasn't as done as much as other seasons, and you could barely have told that it was really the cabin. We could ultimately have just really said that it was um, mostly Ash's home and stuff like that going on in this season. So, anyways, yeah, that's all that I really had much to say for this season. I kind of really rushed through that last episode. I apologize about that. But the last episode was kind of very formulaic in my mind to just be like, oh, okay, well, big old tank and whatever. We end up having to our Ash ends up going and reasonably we are to assume that Ash is probably going to be dead at the very tail end of this season, but we end up having him wake up in seemingly a very distant future to end up finding that there's seemingly a woman with like half human, half cyborg like body, and we are ending up having Ash going into some death race car to ultimately seem that all heck has broken loose and to ultimately showcase that Ash is in some distant future that ultimately he had to be frozen to come back to a time where like the world needs Ash the most, I guess. Because ultimately we had it to where ultimately Ash kills the monster and ends up going back into being like, well, hey, I can go right back to being a hardware salesman again. So I thought that it was kind of a goofy ending. There was a lot of goofy things going on in the very last episode. Recently, it was just a lot of hodgepodging things going on, and so really how it kind of ended was just kind of like, okay, this makes no real rational sense. Like, it's just to lead to a like, oh, okay, I guess we're gonna go the distant future route. Where ultimately, are we gonna have Kelly still be alive? Are we gonna have Pablo still be alive? Are we gonna have any number of whatever still be alive? From looking at it, I don't think there's probably going to be any other seasons coming after this. I think ultimately this last futuristic Ash was just to say like, okay, well, we're just gonna like this is gonna be it with this story. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this season. I thought it was like there was some there were some good moments in here. There was some good episodes, but when looking at it, I still just overall I just liked season two. Out of the three, uh, I thought season one was kind of fun, but season one felt way too much like the Evil Dead movies. Like they were trying to just recapture a lot of Evil Dead in uh, in the first season, and then I think like season two kind of got onto his own, gone into its own thing because reasonably they were trying different things, they were approaching it in a different way, and they ultimately had it to where instead of Ruby, they had Cabal, and I thought that was much more interesting dynamic. Even though I thought it felt like any supernatural show that you've kind of seen at some points. And then kind of season three kind of goes into like kind of uh, like a formula of a way that a last show should ultimately end. To ultimately have Ash have a daughter and so on and so forth, and have that big ending with a big monster, which well, it was okay. The whole tank thing was just, anyways. So that's all I wanted to say about season trace of Ash versus Evil Dead. Yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.